The first thing I remember is the sound of metal ringing inside stone, a bright, hollow note that didn't belong in that basement. Sean had just pried back a false panel when his crowbar kissed something buried in the wall. The air down there was cool and sour, the kind that holds on to years. Dust drifted in the flashlight beam like slow snow, and in the recess behind the insulation sat a heavy rusted cabinet with a little nest of unlabeled cassette tapes stacked on top. No markings, no dates. Just that stubborn gray lock and 5 short names cut into fresh-looking concrete with the impatience of a shaking hand. Tell me where you're listening from, and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. By October, the hills around Hollow Hills turn the color of old copper. The hayfields are shaved low, and the wind carries the smell of wet leaves and wood smoke from a dozen chimneys that never hurry to burn out. Most days, my drive to the sheriff's department takes me along 2-lane blacktop that wanders past a feed store, a bait counter, and a white-steepled church that rings noon with a bell you can feel in your ribs. It's a modest county. We measure distance in miles and time by how long it takes the creek fog to lift. Folks wave from their mailboxes. Doors stay unlocked until the evening news. My unit sits in the back of a brick building that used to be a library. They left the old card catalog in the hallway. We use the drawers to sort stray keys. Cold cases gather in milk crates along my wall, each one labeled in my blocky hand, a name, a date, a single short line that stands in for a whole life gone quiet. My days are steady. Patient, pull a file, read a page check, a lead, make a call that may never be returned. Then lunch at my desk, ham sandwich, hot coffee. One eye on the courthouse steps through a window that rattles whenever a logging truck rolls past. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest, and in a county like ours, honest goes a long way. Sean Middleton is the sort of man you recognize from every farm auction in 3 counties. Tall sleeves rolled a square of tan above the collarbone, where the sun always finds him. He fixes what most folks would rather tear down. That morning, we crossed paths at the permitting desk when he came in to file a routine notice basement demo, new supports planned, egress window on an old farmhouse everybody just calls the Spencer place. He cracked a smile as he signed. "Gonna make it pretty enough for city folks," he said, which is as much blessing as warning in these parts. The Spencer house sits at the last stubborn bend of a gravel road that turns mean after a hard rain. White clapboard sagging porch, a line of choked oaks along the fence that knock their knuckles on the siding when the wind gets up. If you stand in the yard at first light, you can hear milk cows lowing 2 hollows over and a rooster you'll never see. The mailbox lists no names. The county maps say Ridgeview. The old people say, "Oh, that place." They don't elaborate. They just look at the ground as if a board might squeal underfoot. In a small county, you learn to read what isn't said. The house's title history is thin one-owner trust, a tangle of transfers after a long-ago fire, then 2 decades of vacancy. The bank finally let it go for pennies last winter. Investors from Nashville bought it to chase the weekend crowd, cedar swing string lights, fire ring a promise of crickets and quiet. Around here, quiet is a form of faith. You keep front porches swept news past short and storms in their lanes. Kids ride their bikes in loops they've ridden since they were strong enough to balance. Gas is paid in cash more often than card, and folks know whose headlights belong to which driveway. If the pharmacy clerk asks after your blood pressure, it's not nosiness. She's keeping track, so somebody will. We are a county that trusts habit over hurry, and for the most part, habit keeps us safe. Most mornings start the same for me. I pull into the lot just after 7, set my thermos on the blotter, and touch each file spine like I'm counting heads on a field trip. Rhea beats me in half the time, hair pulled back boots, still damp from dew. She works evidence like it's a language we're lucky to understand, patient, faithful. I lean on her for the fine-toothed work that eats hours I pretend I still have. We trade a look through the glass door when something feels odd. It's the sort of shorthand that grows in a place where the same people have been on the same floors long enough to know which ones creak. Henry Spencer was a rumor that lived in the margins before I ever called him a person. His name sat in county licensing ledgers and a few half-filled forms. Nothing that told me what his voice sounded like. If you asked 5 retired clerks about the old foster home, each would give you a different answer. All of them short state took care of that. Wasn't like it sounds. There was a fire. I learned early that some stories get stored like old quilts, folded twice, then covered, then never pulled out unless the weather turns bitter again. People mean well when they do that. They believe forgetting keeps a place warm. The week before the call, our rhythms were tidy. Court ran fast. A neighbor dispute resolved itself with a handshake and a pie. I copied a death certificate for a case that wouldn't move and underlined 2 addresses from out-of-state tips that probably wouldn't stick. The songbirds had shifted to winter chatter, and the air had that sharp, clean edge that tells you first, frost is coming. Coming out of the station, you could see your breath if you exhaled slow. The parking lot gravel clicked like a metronome underfoot. These are the details that anchor a life: how the light hits the flag at 4:30 p.m., which clerk reheats fish in the microwave on Wednesdays, the way the courthouse clock lags 2 minutes behind. The first hairline crack was nothing, just a late call that didn't feel urgent. Dispatch rang my extension at 412, voice low like a teacher stepping into the hallway. "If you're still in," she said, "a contractor's asking for you by name." Folks ask for deputies. They don't usually ask for cold case. "Something about a wall," she added. I wrote the address on the back of a receipt and tucked it under my keyboard, as if it could wait for morning. Plenty of things can. After supper, I walked my street like I do when I've been sitting too long 1 mile up to where the pavement turns to farm road 1 mile back. The sky was the color of the inside of a tin cup. Somebody down the way was grilling cheap steaks and oversalting them. A dog I know by bark, but not by face, kept time 5 houses over. I came back by the church and listened to the bell hit 6. Habit again. Comfort again. An ordinary evening settling without ceremony. You learn to leave your work at the office if you want to stay in it a long time. But little things ride home with you anyway. A phrase you can't place. A number that should have linked but didn't. A name in a ledger that lands with the weight of a hand on your shoulder. That night, a single photograph in an old file took a seat at my kitchen table. A county fair booth faces painted cotton candy, a prize goldfish bagged in water. Nothing wrong in it. Just a girl looking past the camera towards something the lens missed by a foot. I couldn't say why that stuck. I rinsed my plate. I set out clothes for morning. I checked the lock on the back door twice. Sean left a voicemail at 8:03, polite, practical, more apology than alarm. "Detective, it's Middleton. Didn't mean to bother you after hours. We opened up the basement and hit something that's not on the plans." I closed it back up and locked the door. "Can you give me a call?" His voice slowed on basement as if the word itself carried weight. I saved the message and told myself it would keep. Back roads in this county don't mind reminding you where they were before the asphalt. On the way home from my walk, I drove the long route past Ridgeview Road. The old house sat where it always sits, deeper in the trees than it looks on paper porch, slanting toward a yard where rainwater collects and refuses to leave. A plastic contractor's sign leaned against the steps. Blue tarp flapped once and then learned better. Somebody had hung a work light inside. It spilled pale through a window like a fishbowl glow, not warm enough to mean company, just enough to mean we're not done here. The calm before these stories isn't silence. It's a soundscape you come to trust, a screen door breathing in and out, train horns, far-off coffee makers at dawn, ball games low on living room televisions. The town sleeps lighter than it says it does. You can tell by how quickly porch bulbs snap on when tires crunch too slow along the shoulder. You can tell by how many folks remember the same October from different angles and mark it with whether not names. If you'd asked me that week to tell you what was coming, I couldn't have. I would have told you there were 100 ways a house earns a reputation, and almost none of them belong in a report. I would have said permits don't lie, and basements don't hide anything worth keeping. I would have said a lot of things I didn't write down. On Friday, the county fairgrounds were packing up the last of the plywood booths. A teenager pushed a broom stirring dust in sunbeams under the grandstand. I watched him a while from the edge of the lot, coffee cooling in my hand, and wondered if the same broom had been pushed like that 35 Octobers ago. Same angle, same rhythm, same dust, pretending to be smoke in the late light. Memory plays tricks in small towns. It lines up scenes that never met and lets you believe they belonged to each other all along. That afternoon, Rhea rolled a cart of boxes past my door and said she'd finally convinced Records to let us keep the old licensing ledgers on our floor. They smell like a barn, she added, proud anyway. She parked them by the window. Paper warmed in sunlight gives off a sweetness I can't explain. Old glue cotton rag, a whisper of ink that has outlived 3 generations of pens. I slid a volume out at random, more to bless the act than for what I expected to find. Names, dates, signatures I didn't recognize. A familiar address tucked halfway down a page. Ridge View. The clerk's hand had pressed a little harder there, the line darker, more sure. I traced it with my finger. The paper was cool. Around 5, a wind came up out of nowhere and sent dry leaves skating across the lot in tight little circles like they were practicing for something. The courthouse doors banged once and then learned manners. I gathered what I needed, stacked it neat, and locked my drawers. In the hallway, the card catalog drawers clicked once, as if someone had nudged them back into place. The cleaning crew hummed a hymn I knew without knowing I knew it. I told Rhea good night. She told me to bring biscuits if I was coming in early. I don't keep a television on at home. The quiet in my kitchen is the kind that listens back. I washed the coffee thermos, set the filter for morning, and cracked the back door to let the night air settle in. It smelled like damp earth and a little like creosote. Somewhere far off, a dog barked twice and gave up. A train a county over laid down a low, confident horn. I thumbed through my phone out of habit and stopped at Sean's number. My finger hovered over callback. I put the phone down. People think the break in a story comes like thunder. In my line of work, it doesn't. It arrives like an extra heartbeat under your own barely there, but suddenly, all you can hear. That's how it felt when I saw the message light blink again, this time from dispatch, not voicemail. The timestamp was 9:17 p.m. I let the beep finish so I wouldn't cut it off. Detective, she said, no preamble if you're home. Sean's waiting by his truck on Ridgeview. He says he'll leave the porch light on until you get there. I pulled into the dark lane and idled by the gate headlights, washing the white boards of the fence in a shallow arc. The house kept its promise, one yellow bulb burning over the back steps, steady and thin, the kind of light that doesn't reach the yard. No radio, no voices, just the soft hiss of my engine cooling when I shut it off and the slow tick of gravel under my boots. The porch light held patient as a held breath waiting for someone to cross the threshold first. By the time I pulled up the drive that night, the wind had settled into a low, steady hum through the trees, the kind that makes the whole hillside sound like it's breathing. The porch light still burned pale and yellow against the siding, and Sean's truck idled with its headlights off. He stood by the tailgate, arms folded, eyes fixed on the house as if waiting for it to move. I stepped out, slow gravel crunching under my boots. "You said you locked it up," I told him. He nodded without looking at me. I did, but I didn't close it back all the way. Figured you'd want to see it like I found it. His voice was quieter than before, the kind that hangs just above a whisper because anything louder might wake something you don't want to wake. Inside, the air was heavy with old wood and mildew. The entryway floor sagged under our weight, and the dust in the beam of his flashlight looked almost alive. Every step we took stirred the smell of damp insulation and something faintly metallic beneath it. Down the hall, the basement door weighted its latch, bent its frame warped from years of Tennessee humidity. I pulled on my gloves, pushed the door open, and the sound it made was long and tired, like the exhale of the house itself. The basement steps creaked one by one, each groan swallowed into the cold air below. I remember the way the light fell when we reached the bottom flat and blue-white washing the concrete walls like an overexposed photograph. Sean aimed his flashlight toward the far side where insulation still clung in rotten sheets. "Right there," he said. "That's where I hit it." The hole in the wall was small, just big enough for a man's arm to reach through. I knelt, shined my own light inside, and the beam caught the edge of something that shouldn't have been there, a flat metal surface mottled with rust. I brushed away the grit and saw what looked like a handle. The space was narrow, barely enough to work the crowbar. Sean braced the wall while I wedged the claw into the seam. The nails groaned one by one until the panel gave with a sharp pop. A cloud of dust poured out cold and dry like it had been waiting decades to breathe. Behind the panel sat a small alcove carved into the concrete foundation, its edges smooth and deliberate. At the back, a 4-drawer cabinet leaned against the wall. The lock was crusted shut. On top, a shoebox full of cassette tapes, 30, maybe 40 of them, stacked like bricks. I lifted the flashlight closer. None had labels except one. The ink was faded, but I could still make out the words, "Interview number 1, intake. Billy. July 5th, 1987. For a long time, neither of us said anything. The house was silent, except for the soft tick of water dripping from a pipe somewhere behind the furnace. Sean whispered, "You think this has something to do with that fire?" The old foster home. I didn't answer. My eyes had caught on something lower, something carved into the wall just below the cabinet. The letters were uneven, gouged deep into the concrete with what looked like a nail or screwdriver. 5 names each written with the same trembling pressure: Jacob Marn Devon, Sasha Billy. I felt the chill run through me before my mind caught up to what I was reading. I stepped back, took a picture, then another. "We're sealing this," I told him. "Nobody goes down here until I say so." He nodded, once relief flickering in his face. As I called in the find, the house seemed to grow stiller, like it was listening. Outside, the wind had died completely. It was the kind of quiet that comes right before rain or before something else breaks. By morning, the story was already moving faster than the facts. Dispatch was fielding calls from Nashville media before I'd even finished the report. Old-timers at the diner were saying the Spencer ghosts were back. In small towns, truth doesn't travel as quick as rumor. It limps behind it, trying to catch up. When I walked into the station, the clerk at the front desk slid me a cup of burnt coffee and said, "Heard you found the basement. Word spreads even when you don't speak." The first tape played just after noon. We had it logged, tagged, and set up in the cold case room under evidence conditions. I sat at the table with a notepad, Officer Simmons, beside me. The old player clicked as it started a sharp mechanical sound you don't hear anymore. A man's voice filled the room, calm, steady, rehearsed. "This is Henry Spencer, July 5th, 1987. Intake recording, Billy, age 7. For a moment I forgot to breathe. Then came the child's voice, small and uncertain. "State your name for the record," Spencer said. Billy the boy answered softly. "Full name, Billy Daniel Monroe." The air in the room changed. You could feel it. Spencer's tone wasn't cruel. It was worse controlled professional, like he'd practiced empathy until it became a weapon. "How do you feel about coming to live here, Billy?" he asked. The boy hesitated. "Don't know." "Do you miss your mother?" A pause, then a whisper. "She's dead." The next part was almost tender. "Well, here we use words like family and trust," Spencer said. "You'll learn that in time. What about the others? They're your siblings now." His voice dropped to something almost affectionate, and then, without warning, Billy's tone shifted. "Can I see the basement?" he asked. Spencer's reply came smooth, unhurried. "That's a reward. You earn that. Only the good ones go there." I stopped the tape. The player clicked in protest. The room went silent except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. My pulse was in my ears. I looked at Rhea. She was staring straight ahead, jaw tight. "That's enough for now," I said, but the truth was, I needed air. Outside, the afternoon sun looked pale, washed out through the haze that hung over the ridges. The breeze smelled like rain again. By that evening, forensics had finished sweeping the basement. No bones, no blood, no recent activity, but the space behind that wall told a longer story. Someone had poured fresh concrete there decades ago, sealing the cabinet in deliberately. The edges were too clean for accident, too perfect for panic. Whoever did it had time. When I asked the tech about the names, he said the concrete mix dated to the late 80s, give or take a few years. "Same as the fire," I said quietly. He nodded. "Right around then." That night I stayed late at the office. The walls in the evidence room carry sound differently after dark. Every tick of the air vent feels amplified, every rustle from the hallway heavier than it should be. I pulled the old county records, Foster licensing fire reports, missing persons, and laid them out like a puzzle I wasn't ready to solve. The Spencer fire, 1989. Declared accidental. 5 children listed as presumed dead, no remains recovered. The foster father identified through circumstantial evidence. No dental confirmation. Just personal items found near the body. It was the kind of paperwork that made closure look official without proving anything at all. Around midnight, I poured myself stale coffee and sat alone with the photo that had always bothered me, the last picture of those kids taken at the county fair. 5 smiling faces, balloon animals, cheap prizes. They all looked happy enough, except one, the youngest girl, Marn. She wasn't looking at the camera. She was turned to the side, eyes fixed on something beyond the frame. You can't see what it was, only that whatever she saw had pulled her clean out of the moment. I stared at that photo until the clock hit 1, then slid it back into the file. The next morning brought more tapes. The second one had been wedged behind an air vent like someone had hidden it in a hurry. Label read, Marn, July 89. I didn't play it right away. I just held it, the plastic warm in my palm, lighter than it should have been. Something about the timing. The same month the fire started told me it wouldn't be like the first. When I finally pressed play, the tape hissed before the voice came in. "This is interview number 17, Spencer said. Marn, age 6. Then the girl's voice. "I don't like the room." "What room?" "The pink one. I want to go home." Spencer's tone didn't change. "This is home now," he said. "That other place was full of noise. Remember? You said you wanted quiet." Her answer was barely audible. "I want to go outside." A pause, and then that same soft venom in his voice. "Only the good ones do." "You're not ready yet." I stopped the tape again. I couldn't keep listening. The words clung to the air, thick and wrong. I stepped out onto the back stairwell just to hear something real, the hum of traffic, the sound of wind against the flagpole, a dog barking 2 blocks over. Anything that reminded me the world was still ordinary somewhere. Later that afternoon, I drove out to the property again, this time with a full team. The grass around the house had already been trampled by press vans. We set new tape lines, pushed the cameras back, and went in through the rear door. The smell hit first dust mildew, the faint trace of old smoke rising from wood that hadn't burned in decades. Downstairs, the forensics team was measuring, mapping, photographing every inch. One of the techs called me over. "Detective, you need to see this." In the corner, half covered by a tarp, sat a wooden chair bolted to the floor. Small, child-sized. The straps on the armrests were cracked but still fastened. The legs of the chair were scorched near the base. It wasn't furniture. It was something else, a device built for control, not comfort. I turned away for a moment, swallowing back the taste of metal that had settled on my tongue. "Bag it," I said quietly, "and get it out of here before the press smells it." We spent the next 3 days cataloging everything that came out of that basement: tapes, ledgers, fragments of children's drawings found tucked into the cracks of the foundation. One showed a stick figure house and 5 small shapes lined up in front of it. Above them, a sun drawn in black crayon, not yellow. I kept thinking about Billy's voice on that tape. Only the good ones go there. By the 4th night, the story had grown larger than the county. The FBI had called. So had the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. Everyone wanted copies of the evidence logs, the recordings, the photo of that chair. They called it a multi-jurisdictional review. I called it what it was, the reopening of something that should never have been closed. I left the office past midnight again. The roads out of Hollow Hills were empty, just me and the hum of my tires over wet asphalt. The fog was so thick in places it felt like driving through breath. When I passed Ridge View Road, I slowed, glanced toward the tree line. The house was just a shadow now, its windows, boarded porch taped off. But I swear I saw a flicker of light inside, faint and low, like a flashlight moving just once before disappearing. I pulled over, rolled the window down, listened. Nothing but the wind. Maybe it was a trick of the fog. Maybe not. Either way, I didn't get out. Some nights the past doesn't need you to follow it, just needs you to remember it's still there waiting for you to press play again. The morning after that drive through the fog, I stood in the chill outside the Spencer property watching unmarked vans roll in one by one. The county had handed the scene over to the Bureau. Now federal jurisdiction, full-scale excavation, not just a basement search. A gray mist hung low across the hills, and from where I stood the house looked smaller, as if the years had finally caught up to it overnight. A red X had been spray-painted across the porch to mark it condemned, but to me it looked more like a warning. You could almost hear the house breathing, settling into whatever truth we were about to pull from its walls. When I met the woman they'd sent from Quantico, she introduced herself with a handshake that felt like an assessment. Joy Holstead, Behavioral Analysis Unit, early 40s, sharp-eyed, no small talk. "I've reviewed your reports," she said. "You've done good work, Detective Reyes." I told her I wasn't sure whether to take that as a compliment or a warning. She didn't smile. "Both," she said, and nodded toward the door. The air inside was colder than it should have been for mid-October. The forensic team had already stripped half the basement walls bare. The old filing cabinet had been carried out and tagged the chair boxed in a plastic crate big enough for a coffin. Joy's eyes landed on it immediately. She circled the crate slowly, her voice measured. "That's not discipline," she said almost to herself. "That's worship." The word hung in the air a beat too long. I looked at her. "You mean ritual?" "Control," she corrected. "But ritualized, yes. This wasn't about punishment. It was about devotion to an idea." I didn't answer. My flashlight caught the far wall where a single brick looked lighter than the rest, and for a reason I couldn't explain it, pulled at me. I worked the multi-tool into the seam and pried it loose. Behind it, a hollow space, small, deliberate, just enough to fit a hand-rolled bundle wrapped in waxed fabric. Inside were Polaroids, dozens of them. Children caught mid-laugh, mid-sob, blurry, like someone had taken them without permission. Marn, Jacob, Devin, Sasha, Billy, all of them there. One photo showed Billy sitting in a windowless pink room, hands folded in his lap. Eyes turned away from the camera. On the back, written in red ink, were the words, "Reward Day Number 2. Subject, Billy. Room, progress, accepting." My throat went dry. These weren't family keepsakes. They were documentation. I laid the photos flat on a table and stared at them until the edges began to curl under the heat of the work lamps. Joy spoke quietly behind me. He was building something systematic, not random. I nodded. You think he had help? She didn't hesitate. No one builds a world this complete alone. By the time we left the property that evening, the sky was bruised purple and the fog had rolled back in. I remember turning at the end of the drive to look once more at the house. Even boarded up, it seemed to watch us go. Back at the county office, I went straight to records. I needed to know what the house had been before Henry Spencer turned it into a foster home. The archivist on duty was an old hand named Colton, a man who'd worked there since the early 80s. When I asked about Ridge View, his face changed, just a flicker, but enough. That place, he said, it wasn't always called Spencer's. Used to be Ridgeview Home for Boys, behavioral facility, state-run, privately funded. Lot of gray areas back then. He disappeared into the stacks and came back with a cardboard box that looked like it might fall apart in his hands. Inside, faded papers, carbon copies, inspection reports, rosters. One sheet caught my eye, dated March 7, 1983. Incident report. Subject refused to participate in reward session. Restrained overnight. At the bottom, the signature supervisor, HS. I felt the blood move in my neck. He hadn't just inherited the property. He'd been trained there. That night, I sat at my desk long after the rest of the building had gone dark. The hum of the vending machine was the only sound in the hall. I took out the second tape, the one marked Marn, July, '89, and pressed play. The first seconds were quiet, then the familiar tone of his voice, steady, soft, rehearsed. Do you want to be here today? Marn silence. Then the girl's whisper, No. Why not, he asked. I don't like the room. What room? The pink one. I want to go home. His voice stayed even. This is home now. That other place was full of noise and garbage. Remember? Then after a pause, you said I could go outside. Only the good ones do, he told her. You're not ready yet. I stopped the tape. It was enough. The sound of his calmness was worse than any scream. I turned off the desk lamp and sat in the dark until my eyes adjusted. The rain had started again, tapping against the window like fingers. There was a feeling I hadn't shaken since the first tape, the sense that he'd kept them, not just to remember, but to be found. Like he wanted his voice to outlive him. The next day, I ran a background check on the name that had appeared on one of the older Ridgeview forms, Henry Spencer, Assistant Supervisor, 1982-84. The file said he'd left after a fire-related injury at the facility. My stomach dropped when I saw the date, August 1984, 5 years before the second fire. The pattern was beginning to take shape. When the Bureau expanded the search, I asked to be part of the follow-up. We focused on the last known license renewal from Spencer's foster care operation in 1988. There was a signature beside his Linda Mercer State Foster Care Coordinator. She'd signed off on every placement. Most of those children had been labeled behaviorally unfit, the kind who fell through cracks nobody bothered to mend. That afternoon, Rhea came to my desk with a new find. This just came through, she said, laying an envelope down. Inside was another tape unmarked except for a single word written in small block letters. Rio. I frowned. We have a Rio on record. She shook her head. None. Not in any file. I played it that evening. The tape began with static, then Spencer's voice again. This is our first day. You don't have to talk yet, but you have to stay awake. A pause. Then a child's breathing uneven, close to the microphone. Do you hear me? Rio, he said. Silence. Then softer. Don't look at the door. It's not going to open again until you're ready. I pressed stop. There was no intake record, no report, nothing connecting a boy named Rio to the official placements. But when I dug through the oldest Ridgeview rosters there, it was scrawled in pencil. Barnes Rio H., age 6, transferred July 1986. The destination line was blank. Next to it, a note in handwriting I recognized from Spencer's old forms, still not adjusting. Recommend isolation for improved compliance. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling tiles that all looked the same until you've spent too many nights under them. Spencer hadn't started this in Hollow Hills. He'd brought it here after perfecting it somewhere else. Rio had been his test case, the first child to disappear without anyone filing a report. It was near midnight when I called Joy. She answered on the first ring. "I think I found his prototype," I said. "A boy named Rio. No records after '86. There was a long pause on the line. "Then he was the first," she said quietly. "And if Spencer practiced on him, he's buried deeper than the rest." For the next few days, I lived on coffee and drive-through sandwiches, moving between the courthouse, the morgue archives, and the State Records Center outside Nashville. Every trail seemed to lead into the same blind alley of missing paperwork and half-burned logs. The state had restructured child services in 1990. Whole sections of the old registry were lost or destroyed. But buried in a box of microfiche labeled foster care, 1985 to 1988, I found something else, a transfer form from the Ridgeview facility to an unlisted destination. The destination code was 6 digits. The first 3 spelled HH001. Hollow Hills. He'd brought them here directly. When I stepped outside the records building, the sky had turned to bruised clouds, and thunder was moving over the ridges like furniture being dragged across a floor. I sat in my car and listened to it roll until the rain came. Back at my apartment, I poured a drink and spread the files across the table. In the quiet hum of the room, the tapes sat stacked like silent witnesses. Each one carried a date, a child, a voice pulled from decades of dust. I thought of the chair, the pink room, the photo of Billy staring just off frame. I thought of Rio's whisper caught between breaths. "Don't look at the door." There was no clear line between investigation and obsession anymore. I kept hearing Joy's words. Men like Spencer don't see themselves as predators. They see themselves as saviors. And I wondered what kind of man could believe salvation was something you earned by taking a child's name away. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I pulled out the map of Tennessee. I marked Ridgeview Hollow Hills and the route between them. 2 red pins, 59 miles apart. A lifetime for the children who never made it past either. The rain outside slowed to a drizzle. In the stillness that followed, I realized something I'd been avoiding. If Spencer was alive, he hadn't just built a system to control children. He'd built one that erased them. And if he'd been doing it this long, there was no reason to think he'd stopped. When I finally turned off the lamp, the room went dark except for the faint glow of the city beyond the glass. I closed my eyes, but the names carved into that concrete wall were still there waiting. And behind them, the unspoken truth I could feel tightening like a fist around the whole case. Henry Spencer didn't die in that fire. He walked away from it. And somewhere out there, a man who once called himself a savior was still listening to the voices he left behind. It was close to dawn when I parked outside the last known address tied to Henry Spencer, though that wasn't the name on the mailbox. The letters spelled Halverson Clean and Deliberate screwed into the side of a modest brick house on the outskirts of Jonesboro. The place sat quiet under a low fog, the kind that blurs the edges of everything it touches. My hands rested on the steering wheel longer than they should have. The bureau had confirmed the match, same birth date, same scar from an old fire, and a history pieced together through a trail of aliases. But sitting there, I couldn't quite picture him as a 75-year-old man with arthritis and a tidy lawn. Some part of me expected the voice from the tapes to be waiting behind the door. Still young, still smooth, untouched by the years that followed. Joy arrived a few minutes later, her rental crunching the gravel beside mine. She gave a short nod, eyes sharp, the kind that didn't need small talk. "We do this calm," she said. "No raised voices, no surprises." I nodded. There was a time when that would have sounded procedural. Tonight it sounded like a prayer. We walked up the path together. The porch light was off, but the glow from a television flickered faintly through the curtains. Joy knocked. No answer. She tried again, firmer this time. A shadow moved past the window, then the sound of locks being undone one by one. The door opened just enough to reveal a narrow face, thin gray hair combed back, and eyes that registered us with quiet calculation. "Mr. Halverson," Joy said. The man hesitated. "You must have the wrong house." "We're with the Bureau," she replied evenly. "We need to speak with you about your past work with Ridgeview Home." His jaw tightened the faintest twitch at the mention of the name. He opened the door wider, motioned us in, and then did something that unsettled me more than denial. He smiled. "You've come a long way to talk about ghosts," he said. The living room smelled faintly of oil soap and old paper. A bookshelf lined the wall filled with psychology texts worn at the spines, and in the corner a record player quietly spun a symphony that had reached its end, the needle clicking softly against silence. We sat. Joy took the lead. "We've recovered evidence from Hollow Hills," she said, "tapes, records, and other items bearing your handwriting. We also have witness statements tying you to the foster program after your resignation from Ridgeview." The old man folded his hands skin thin as parchment. "You mean my work with the children?" he said, tone almost wistful. "It was never about harm. It was about correction. Structure. The world forgets that discipline is mercy." His words came slow, deliberate, shaped by a mind still too sure of itself. I kept my voice steady. "They weren't your subjects, Mr. Spencer." His eyes flicked toward me, then the faintest trace of amusement. "That's not my name anymore." Joy reached into her case and slid a photograph across the table, one of the Polaroids we'd found, the one labeled Reward Day Number 2. He looked at it for a long time, thumb brushing the edge. "Billy," he said softly, as if greeting an old memory. He was a hard one, always asking questions. "What did you do to him?" I asked. "I taught him to listen," he answered, "to still himself. They all wanted to be good. That was the bargain." The air in the room seemed to thin with every word. He spoke with a calm that didn't belong in a conversation about suffering. "You talk like it was a study," Joy said. "But we both know what happened in that house wasn't treatment. It was captivity." He looked up at her, then the smile gone. "Do you really think I started that fire?" he asked. "I didn't. But I didn't stop it either." That silence after was the kind that hums just below hearing. Rain began to tap faintly against the windows, and for a moment all I could hear was that sound, the same rhythm that had followed me since the night we found the tapes. "Then what happened to the children?" I asked. His answer came as a whisper, almost reverent. "They burned everything," he said, "except what I hid." When we left the house, the rain had picked up. It carried that sharp mineral smell you only get before dawn when the world is half awake. Joy walked ahead, shoulders stiff, her voice low. "He's not done talking," she said. "He wants to tell it his way." I knew she was right. Men like him always did. They built their own narratives brick by brick, convinced it would outlast the truth. Back at the motel, I couldn't sleep. I replayed his words, his tone, that detached conviction that what he'd done was mercy. I sat at the desk with the lamp low, flipping through the old files again, trying to find the missing name he'd hinted at, the one he called his son. The reference was buried in a 1991 foster care audit. Peter Halverson, guardian to one dependent minor male, first name redacted. The address listed was the same one we'd just left. He hadn't been living alone all these years. By mid-morning, the Bureau had surveillance up around the property. Joy and I reviewed the footage from the previous week. Every night, the same routine: porch light on at dusk, off by 10, blinds drawn. But at exactly 3:14 a.m. each night, another light flickered on in the back room, a faint, brief glow that lasted less than a minute. Too short for reading, too steady for passing through. Someone was still moving in that house. We returned that afternoon with a warrant. The door opened easier this time, no smile waiting. The house felt colder, heavier. "Where's your son?" I asked. He didn't answer, just motioned toward the hallway. We followed him down a narrow corridor lined with framed drawings, childlike sketches, each one depicting a room with no windows. The last one stopped me cold, a figure seated in a chair, head bowed, with 5 smaller figures standing around it in a circle. He stopped outside a closed door at the end of the hall. "He doesn't talk to strangers," he said quietly. Joy stepped forward, hand on the latch. "We'll take it from here." The hinges moaned as the door opened. Inside, the blinds were drawn tight. The air was stale. A single mattress lay against the wall, surrounded by shelves stacked with VHS tapes labeled by year. On a desk sat a tape recorder, newer than the ones we'd found in Hollow Hills, and beside it, a notebook filled with cramped handwriting. The first page read, "Session Notes. Echo. Progress adequate." We called for backup and cleared the house room by room, but there was no sign of a child, no one living there but Spencer. Or so we thought. When the team began cataloging the tapes, one slipped from the shelf and rolled under the bed. It had no label. I crouched, reached for it, and when I did, I saw a small indentation in the carpet, a perfect oval, as if something had rested there for years. Maybe a chair. Maybe a person. Later that night, when we played the tape, a different voice came through. Younger, hoarse, quiet. "He called me Echo," it said. I stayed. I listened. I remembered. There was no question now. One had survived. One had stayed behind. The recording went on describing the fire, the crawl space, the years in silence. But then it shifted, warning us in that same calm, haunting tone. He wasn't alone. There were others. If you want to find them, follow the missing files. The homes that burned. I sat there in the dark long after the tape ended. The rain outside had stopped, leaving only the drip of water from the eaves. Joy leaned against the wall, eyes distant. "He wasn't confessing," she said finally. "He was handing it off." I nodded. The case was bigger than Hollow Hills, bigger than Spencer himself. Every word on that tape felt like a breadcrumb leading deeper into a forest we hadn't realized we were already standing in. We arrested him the next morning. He didn't resist. He didn't ask for a lawyer. As they let him out, he turned once toward me. "You think you've ended something?" he said softly. "But you've only woken it." I wanted to answer, but there was nothing left worth saying. He was a man who'd lived inside his own delusion so long he mistook it for salvation. As the cruiser pulled away, I caught sight of the house through the rear window. The curtains stirred once, just slightly, like someone had brushed past them. I stood there until the motion stopped, the quiet closing back in like water over a stone. Somewhere inside that house, the ghost of a child's voice. Echo was still telling its story long after the man who created it was gone. And I knew then the investigation wasn't over. It had just changed shape. When they took Henry Spencer into custody, the sky was the color of cold steel. It had rained through the night, and the road in front of his house glistened like a mirror that couldn't decide what to reflect. He didn't fight, didn't ask for a lawyer, didn't speak another word, just walked to the cruiser like a man who had been rehearsing that moment for years. When the door shut, it wasn't the slam that stuck with me. It was the sound of the rain picking up right after, as if the weather itself wanted to drown the silence he left behind. For days after, that house in Jonesboro stayed under watch. Crews moved through it like archaeologists dusting bagging cataloging. They found more tapes, more notebooks, but what they didn't find mattered just as much. No trace of the boy who called himself Echo. No living soul. The lab said the most recent handwriting matched Spencer's own, which meant the recordings had been made long after he stopped taking in children. He'd built a private world there, half memory, half madness, and it felt like walking through the inside of someone's obsession. When the trial came, it wasn't a spectacle. No cameras, no headlines that lasted more than a week. Most folks had already moved on before the gavel even dropped. But for those of us who'd spent months piecing the story together, sitting in that courtroom felt like watching a ghost finally realize he was seen. Spencer sat quiet through most of it, shoulders bowed, eyes lowered, no apology offered. He pled guilty to multiple counts of unlawful confinement abuse and homicide under special circumstances, a lifetime's worth of cruelty reduced to legal language. The judge read the sentence slow, letting the weight of it settle. Life without parole. He didn't flinch. Afterward, I walked out of the courthouse alone. The steps were slick with rain again, same as the day they found the cabinet. I remember looking back at the doors as they closed behind him, and it struck me how final it all felt and yet how little it changed. Justice is a word that sounds cleaner than it ever feels. What we'd done was necessary, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like stitching up a wound that would never fully heal. In the weeks that followed, the Bureau opened a wider inquiry into the network of old behavioral homes scattered through the state, places that operated under different names but shared the same bones. Files turned up missing funding trails, dried out halfway through paper chains, and several former employees claimed ignorance or age. Some cried, some didn't. The truth was, most of them had chosen not to look, and by the time we came along, too many of those children's names had already fallen out of every record that mattered. One evening, I drove back to Hollow Hills. The Spencer property had been stripped down to its frame, no more basement, no more walls hiding their secrets. The county planned to bulldoze what was left and turn the land over for reclamation. I stood by the fence as the sun went down behind the ridge. The light caught in the weeds the way it does just before dusk when everything looks almost gold. For a moment, the air felt still again, like it had the night we first found the tapes. I thought about those 5 names carved into the concrete: Jacob, Marn, Devin, Sasha, Billy, and how in the end they were the ones who spoke loudest, even without a voice left to give. I'd spent so long chasing evidence that I'd forgotten what silence can say. The sound of crickets starting up along the tree line, the distant low of cattle down the hill, it all felt like the world reminding me that life keeps moving even in the shadow of what we uncover. People always ask if cases like this ever really end. The truth is, they don't. They just change shape. The paperwork closes, the headlines fade, but the echo, the memory of what was done, it stays long after everyone else has stopped listening. A few months later, a package arrived at my office, no return address. Inside was a small cassette tape and a note written in a neat, unfamiliar hand, for the one who found us. The handwriting wasn't Spencer's. The tape was newer, the kind you could buy at any gas station, but the sound that came through when I pressed play was unmistakable. A young man's voice, steady and sure, but worn around the edges like someone who'd been quiet for too long. He called me Echo, he said, because I didn't have a name. I stayed. I listened. I remembered. There was a pause, breathing, maybe a faint creak of wood, and then, "You found him. That means I can stop." The recording ended there. No location, no explanation. The text traced the origin to a small post office in Arkansas, mailed 3 days before Spencer's sentencing. We never found who sent it. Some said it was a copy, an old tape mailed late. Others thought maybe it was him, the last one who survived, finally ready to let go. I don't know which I believe. I just know that when I listened to it again that night in my kitchen, something in his tone felt final, like the closing of a door that had been open too long. Spencer died a year later in prison. Natural causes, they said. No funeral, no claims on the body. The state cremated him, filed the ashes under an unmarked number. When I read the report, I didn't feel relief. I felt the same quiet I'd carried since the first day of the case, the kind that doesn't fade, but finds its place beside you. Evil doesn't vanish just because the man who carried it does. It lingers in the stories of the people who have to keep telling it. In the time since Hollow Hills has changed in small ways. The old Ridgeview Road has been repaved, lined with new mailboxes. A family with 2 little girls bought the land where the house once stood. They planted a red maple there, one of those trees that turns bright as fire every fall. I drive past sometimes, and it always catches my eye, that flash of color against the gray hills. Life insists on growing back, even in the soil of terrible things. I still have the tapes locked away in evidence, though some nights I wonder if the dead would rest easier if we burned them. But that's not our choice to make. What's recorded has to be remembered. What's remembered has to be kept. Because the moment we let silence take over again, it starts all over somewhere else. When I think of those children now, I don't picture the photographs or the case files. I see small hands pressed in wet cement, the carved letters drying under a single bulb. I hear the rain against the old porch roof, the hum of the recorder spinning after the voice has stopped. Those sounds never leave you. They just settle lower like sediment. I've spent most of my career trying to give shape to things people would rather forget. This case taught me something I didn't expect, that memory isn't just about holding on to the pain. It's about carrying the truth long enough that it outlasts the people who tried to bury it. And if one boy's voice calling himself Echo could survive all that time to tell us what happened, then the least we can do is listen until the last word fades. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark. Because the truth is, some echoes aren't meant to fade. They're meant to keep us awake.